Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm very excited about today's episode. This is my absolute favorite aspect of ufology, and that is onboard UFO encounters. These are the kinds of cases that are absolutely undeniable, certainly for the witnesses, as they go to the very heart of the UFO phenomenon. I call this episode, You Must Tell the People. 7 spectacular onboard UFO encounters. These cases are the kinds that really have the potential to answer the many questions surrounding this subject, such as who are these beings, these visitors to our planet, where do they come from, why are they here? And I think you'll see that several of these cases really provide some amazing answers to these kinds of questions. I have 7 cases for you from all over the world, including Argentina, Russia, Wales, Indiana, Puerto Rico, Texas, and Wyoming. These cases are truly extraordinary. There are some who say that these can be explained away as memories retrieved through hypnosis, false memories, but we can easily lay that theory to rest because all of these cases were fully consciously recalled, except for one case in which the lady used meditation and self-hypnosis. So you certainly can't say that she was led by any hypnotist. A number of these cases involve multiple witnesses, and over half involve some sort of physical evidence. So I think these cases show that this cannot be easily explained away as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperception, or mental illness. So let's just get started with our first case, which I call Friends from Another Planet. This one occurred in September of 1973 in the Black Hills National Forest in Northeast Wyoming. This is technically a multiple witness case. It's also quite rare because this occurred during daytime. I love this case because it is very extensive and really presents all the sort of procedures and experiences that people have when they are taken on board. This first case comes from Donald M. Ware. He's a MUFON field investigator and was the Florida State Director for MUFON. And from MUFON field investigator and director of publications, Robert E. Reed. The case was published in the autumn 1993 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. It was one afternoon in 1973 when a married couple, Randal and Elizabeth Richmond, those are pseudonyms, were driving westbound on State Road 24 through the Black Hills National Forest. This is located in northeast Wyoming. They were on their way back to their rural home in the northeast section of the state. Elizabeth was 51 years old and she wore a wig. This comes up during her encounter. During the drive, they were puzzled and amazed to see a large fiery red object hovering ahead of them off to the side of the road. It appeared to be a solid object, dome-shaped on top with a flat bottom. It looked much larger than the sun did in the sky. They estimate about 4 times the size. And they were both commenting on how strange it looked, when suddenly there was a strange shift, and the next thing they remembered, they were looking at the sun low on the horizon in the western sky. Now they knew then that what they had just seen could not have been the sun, and Elizabeth was very curious, and she suggested that they return to investigate, but her husband Randall said that there was no use because the object would be gone. Both were very curious because although they believed they had seen a UFO, the thing that they had seen did not look like the images or photographs of flying saucers that they were familiar with. So arriving home, they became even more concerned when they saw that it was now an hour later than it should have been. And looking in the mirror, Elizabeth was shocked to see how tired she looked. Waking up the next morning and putting on her lipstick, she did notice a strange cut above her lip that had not been there before, and when her husband gave her a morning kiss, he also noticed this cut and asked her where she got it. Of course, Elizabeth had no idea. Then her husband shared that that evening he had just had a nightmare, which is very unusual for him as he rarely recalled his dreams. But he said that in his nightmare he dreamt that he was in their car on a hill and the car began to drift backwards and he was unable to stop it. It really caused him a lot of fear. And the very next night he had the same exact nightmare, and in fact night after night this nightmare returned, causing him often to wake up screaming. After several nights of this, Randal went to bed one night and remarked that he hoped that he would stop having that crazy dream. And about a week after that, these nightmares stopped. Now, by a strange synchronicity, it wasn't long after their encounter that they attended a lecture by UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek, and they were amazed to see a photograph displayed very much like what they had seen. But still, the idea that their missing time might indicate a more extensive encounter didn't really enter their minds, even though they had both earlier read The Interrupted Journey by John Fuller, which presented the very famous case of Betty and Barney Hill's onboard UFO encounter in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in 1961. Sadly, a few years later in 1984, Randal Richmond passed away. 3 years after that, in 1987, Elizabeth happened to read the book Intruders by Bud Hopkins, all about people who have been taken on board, and this brought back the memory of her own UFO sighting and, more importantly, the missing 1 hour of time. So not long after that, she was visiting her home state of Florida, and she attended a Pensacola MUFON meeting and spoke with other experiencers. This encouraged her to research her own experience, and she met with researcher Dr. Dan Overlaid, Ph.D. He is very well known for hypnotizing other contactees. So she asked him if he would consider hypnotizing her, but his caseload was too full, so he instructed her on trying self-hypnosis and meditation to retrieve memories of missing time. So Elizabeth took his advice. She went home and used these techniques Dr. Overlaid had suggested, basically counting down from 100 down to 1, relaxing, and trying to go back and remember what happened. And she was shocked when she immediately broke through the walls of amnesia and was able to remember everything that happened during her missing time encounter. She recalled that after seeing the fiery red UFO with her husband as they drove along State Road 14, she found herself paralyzed in the front seat of the car. Immediately the car was pulled backwards and levitated up into the sky off the mountain road and into an opening in the bottom of a huge circular craft. Inside the craft, and still sitting in their car, they were surrounded by several 4 to 5 foot tall figures with large dome-shaped bald heads, huge black almond-shaped wraparound eyes, small noses, and slit-like mouths. In other words, typical gray ETs. She said the beings had long dangling arms with claw-like nails on their hands, and they were dressed in metallic gray jumpsuits. The Greys quickly and very gently took them out of the car. Elizabeth no longer saw her husband, but found herself being led to a room and put on an examination table. 3 aliens stood on one side of the table and 3 on the other side, and 1 was at the foot of the table. Elizabeth was now terrified and she wanted to scream, but she said she was unable to cry out. One of the Greys took her hand gently and began to communicate to her telepathically, telling her not to be afraid. Elizabeth recalled that the Grey's hand felt smooth and cool, and that she then proceeded to have a long telepathic conversation with the Grey who was holding her hand. She asked the Grey, "Who are you?" The Grey replied, "Friends from another planet." She asked, "What do you want with us?" And the Grey replied, "To help you." This helped to alleviate her fear, and Elizabeth watched as the other ETs began to pass a large, eye-like instrument over her body. She had the impression that they were very pleased with the results of their examination. She heard a strange humming noise in her head as the Greys began to communicate to each other, but she could not understand what they were saying. They then proceeded to put some kind of instrument up her nose and into her sinus cavity. She could feel it going deep inside her head, but despite this, she felt no pain. She was then pulled up into a sitting position, and the Greys proceeded to do some sort of procedure to the back of her head, but she was unable to see what it was. Now at this point, the Greys discovered that Elizabeth was wearing a wig, and they seemed surprised by this, and became amused because she watched one of the bald gray aliens touch her wig and then touch his own head. Elizabeth had the impression that he was indicating that perhaps they should wear a wig. She recalled thinking that the Greys had a nice sense of humor. Now I'll just let Elizabeth describe what happened next in her own words. As she says, "After the operation, I was carried to another room, and the alien who had held my hand came in and sat before me on a low couch. Taking both my hands in his, he said his name was Mag, and he was so happy to see me again. He said that he had known me when I was one of them, that we had been mates, and that we had 2 daughters who were aboard this spacecraft. He asked if I wished to see them. In deep shock, I answered yes. He touched a light, doors opened, and 2 beautiful aliens entered the room. As I stared at them, memory began to stir, and I knew I was their mother. I remembered their names. I called to them, and they rushed across the room and embraced me. I was extremely emotional, and when I could control myself, I asked why I wasn't with them. They said I had volunteered to reincarnate on Earth, as did many others, to help usher in a new era of world peace, and we would learn more about it later when the time is right." So the gray ET Mag then explained that they had placed an implant in her head which would help her to remember their daughters, and that he was pleased to see that it was working. This was really all Elizabeth was able to remember. She did try using self-hypnosis 2 more times, and the same exact details came through. Now Elizabeth did later use meditation sessions and was able to establish what she believes is telepathic communication with the ETs, and they provided all kinds of information. They told her that their home planet was in the Sirius star system, that they had overcome wars, disease, and any unkind or selfish thoughts. They told her that they live largely underground in cities protected by transparent, shatterproof material. They have great storehouses of resources to provide for everybody's needs. Everyone works for the good of everyone. They have no money, no competition, no greed. They told her that they monitor Earth and humanity very closely at all times, and that our planet will be undergoing great changes which will require their assistance to survive, which is why they are permitting their presence on Earth to be widely known. They reassured her that the great changes involve a natural cycle and that there is no need to fear this. Although many will transition, they said, from the physical realm to the spiritual realms, some will survive and some will be transplanted to other planets where they can adapt and a new era of world peace will reign. The ETs told her that her ET soul had entered her body at age 22 during the birth of her first son. This interested Elizabeth as she remembered that she had nearly died while giving birth to her first son, and after the difficult pregnancy, she felt like she was a much different person, stronger and tougher. Elizabeth does admit that she has had many psychic experiences throughout her life. For example, in 1956, at age 34, she received a clear telepathic message out of the blue saying, "You have been chosen to carry the word." She also says that at age 40, she began to experience messages from deceased people, mediumship, including, she believes, from the renowned psychic Edgar Cayce. Now regarding her case, researcher Donald M. Ware writes, and I quote, "She is a kind lady who gave us no reason to doubt her truthfulness. We consider this case to be a significant unknown of the CE4 type because of the credibility of the witness and the content of the reality it describes. This seems to be another case indicating that now is the time for an abductee to remember some previously blocked information." Truly astonishing case. It's a shame that the husband passed away and wasn't able to share his side of the story. But I like the case because it was investigated by a very experienced researcher. Again, it does not involve hypnosis. And there's just so much information, not only a physical examination, which is of course the most common procedure that people experience, She was basically given a tour of the craft, had a long conversation with the ETs, learned why they were here, where they're from, and they also provided information about upcoming Earth changes. This is a very common message received by contactees. They also said that should there be an existential crisis, and they said that there will be, they will be scooping people off the planet and relocating them to other planets. This is another message you hear from contactees who have really dug in and remembered all of their experiences or had extensive interactions with the ETs themselves. So yeah, an important and amazing case. Now let's move to the next one. This one is also equally astonishing and equally extensive. And in fact, the witness claims he was taken to the ET's planet. I call this one, You Must Tell the People. This occurred on July 21st, 1975 in a forested area outside the small village of Kostino, Russia. This was also very thoroughly investigated, and it's an extraordinary case because not only was the witness physically examined, but he had long conversations with the ETs who shared all kinds of information that really aligns with a lot of other cases. This complicated and extensive case comes from Soviet researchers, but apparently was revealed by papers sneaked out of Russia in 1991 by researcher George Knapp. The witness is Anatoly Tolya Malishev. Born in 1957, Tolya, as he likes to be called, says that he had his first experience around age 6 or 7 in the Fergana region. He had walked to the edge of town when he saw a disc-shaped craft sitting on the ground about 600 feet away from him. 3 human-looking figures in jumpsuits began to approach him, but he became very frightened and ran away. It was about 10 years later, on July 21st, 1975, that Tolya, now age 17 and working as a farmer in a collective in the Solneknogorsk area of Russia, went to the forest not far from the village of Kostino to draw the sunset. He had always been interested in drawing since he was a young boy. So he was in a forest glade he had never been to before, and he was deeply focused finishing his drawing when he began to feel a sense of nervous anxiety for no apparent reason. And it grew worse, so around 8 p.m. he decided to return home. As he was walking home through the fields, he came upon a silver disc-shaped craft, about 42 feet wide and 13 feet high, he estimates. It had a glowing ring around the perimeter circumference, and almost immediately, 3 human-looking figures, each about 5.5 feet tall, that's 1.7 meters, emerged from the craft and approached him. There were 2 men and 1 woman, each wearing silver jumpsuits with an unknown emblem on the right chest. They appeared to be about 25 years old, very attractive, with unusual eyes. They moved in sync with an easy grace. Now, alarmed by the sight, Tolya was immediately overcome with fear. As though understanding his fear, the woman approached, reached out her hand and smiled, and said, "Good day. Don't be afraid of us. We come from another planet. What are you doing?" Tolya replied, "I am making a sketch," and showed them the sketch. As Tolya says, "They looked at me very attentively, blinking seldom, which made their look more perspicacious. I heard the voice of a pleasant timbre, but not clearly. I heard the Russian speech, not with my ears, but with the back of my head. I saw their lips moving as if talking." Now one of the men proceeded to hold up a small rectangular instrument. An antenna came out of it and then quickly retracted. And as Tolya says, "They suggested me to go into the apparatus. The woman went in advance. The men went after her, holding my shoulders. When we reached the desk, we were as if pulled into the apparatus. Inside, an even light lit up rows of blinking instruments. Only the central part of the room was seen, and the rest was in a haze. There was a round table and some places for sitting by it. I was suggested to take a seat and undress." Now Tolya was confused and nervous, but he proceeded to take off his clothes. The woman who was present apparently sensed that she was the source of Tolya's nervousness, and she disappeared into the haze at the edges of the room. And as Tolya says, "They fastened detectors to my hands and legs, and put on my head something like a crown. Now the ETs told him that he had a strong body and nervous system, but that his mental facilities were below average. This was true, he had a very basic education, but they did seem surprised at the strength of his body, and Tolya explained to them that he was into sports, and they asked him, "What is this?" And he told them, "It's physical labor." They then showed him a screen which displayed a busy street in the city of Solneknogorsk, several miles away. They then escorted Tolya from the craft and returned into it. Tolya watched as the craft rose upward. The light around it changed from blue to white. It rose up in the sky just a few thousand feet, hung there briefly, while what appeared to be some kind of instrument came out from the side of the craft, but moments later it landed again. The ETs came out again, and now offered to take Tolya to their planet. They said the trip there and back would take about 40 minutes each way, and they explained that it was about 3 of our light years away. Now Tolya agreed and entered the craft. Inside, he sat on a chair and looked out through an open porthole, watching the Earth become smaller and smaller. Next he saw the moon approaching, and they began to fly around it, and they showed him strange artificial structures on the far side of the moon, which they said were ET bases. He started to feel slightly ill at one point, and the ETs proceeded to adjust the atmosphere inside the craft, which relieved this feeling. At one point they asked him if he wanted anything to eat, and they gave him, quote, a salad as a mixture of different vegetables. And to his surprise, they gave him a bottle of a Russian brand of mineral water called Borjomi. Finally arriving at their destination, they landed and they exited the craft. Outside, Tolya looked at the sky but did not see any sun. He said the sky was brightly lit, a uniform white. The air was fresh and clean, quote, as a pine forest. He did notice the gravity was slightly less, which made it easier for him to move around. He said they stood on a material that seemed similar to concrete. Off in the distance, he saw dome-shaped and prism-shaped buildings. He saw other craft flying, other UFOs. He saw a man flying through the air with his arms folded across his chest. He was then taken to a building, and inside he said the walls would, quote, disperse as needed. And inside this building he saw other strange humanoids, including one which was about 10 feet tall, with rounded shoulders, deep-set eyes, a straight nose, and skin covered with bristling hair. He saw other humanoids that were 3 feet tall with greenish faces, which he was told were actually biological robots. They demonstrated for him how they were able to take off their jumpsuits by simply raising their hands in a certain way, which caused the jumpsuit to just fall off by itself. They were also able to put them on by just, quote, covering themselves with something, and the jumpsuit would automatically form around their body. He then met with another human-looking man who claimed to be from Moscow and said he was actually living with them. During his encounter, he saw an object, a strange object, on a table and tried to slip it into his pocket and take it as proof of his encounter, but he was caught and was immediately ordered to put it back. But they then told him that if he wanted, he was welcome to stay with them permanently. But Tolya declined. They proceeded to tell him many other things, including that they would not allow a thermonuclear war to take place on Earth, and in an extreme case, they would be able to block all electricity and all military equipment. They said a day would eventually come when ETs make mass contact with humanity, and that it would be, quote, a great holiday for all humanity. As the visit winded to an end, they told him, quote, everything you have learned, you must tell people who are interested in it and who will believe you. They then went back to the craft, re-entered it, and returned to Earth. They returned him to the same glade where he had been taken, and it was now 10 p.m., 2 hours later. Tolya's case was later thoroughly investigated by numerous researchers. He took them to the exact landing spot. He did consent to hypnosis and told the same story under hypnosis with just a few new added details. Interestingly, one of the investigators did spend several nights at, quote, Melishev's glade, and twice he observed a UFO, once quite close up. That's the kind of onboard experience I'd like to have. Human-looking ETs, they offer food and drink, they take you to their planet, they even offer him to stay with them permanently, which of course he declined. But I have to wonder if I would decline or not. I don't know. Very interesting that he met another Russian man who was apparently living with them and apparently accepted the invitation to stay with them on a permanent basis. Just an astonishing encounter in so many different ways. Now let's move to the next encounter, which is much shorter and much more your standard onboard encounter. I call this one 15 hours on board a UFO. This one occurred on June 16 and June 28 in 1980 in Rosario, Argentina. And this one is an interesting case in a number of ways because usually missing time involves maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes to an hour or two, but 15 hours is a pretty long time. I think you'll find this a fascinating case. This case first appeared in the La Razón newspaper. The witness is Juan Jorge Gomez, a 29-year-old carpenter. He was a single man who lived with his parents, Bernardo Gomez and Anastasia Alarcón, in South Rosario in Santa Fe, Argentina. It was on the night of June 16, 1980 that Juan was staying with his aunt in a bedroom. He was lying in bed listening to the radio when suddenly both his bedroom light and radio went out. He immediately saw a bright light streaming in through the small bedroom window, and following this, 4 3-foot-tall figures appeared in his bedroom. He said they were dressed in yellow jumpsuits and helmets. They said no words, but gave off a kind of unintelligible buzzing noise. This standoff lasted about 3 or 4 minutes, and then the ETs disappeared in a manner that the witness did not describe. Afterwards, Juan did tell his parents, who really weren't sure what to make of his story. Though in confirmation of Juan's experience, it was learned that 2 days earlier, there were UFO reports over Rosario. Now Juan himself was in disbelief of what happened, because prior to his experience, he did not believe in, quote, those things. This bedroom encounter turned out to be a prelude to a much more extensive encounter, because it was just 12 days later on June 28, 1980, that Juan was walking along Boulevard Orono 4000 in the heart of the city of Rosario. It was a half hour before midnight, and he was passing an empty lot when he noticed an intense light in the sky. Now his first thought was that a car was approaching, but then he looked around and saw that the light was coming from above him in the sky, and the next thing he knew, he was, quote, sucked up by the light as if lifted up. Now what happened next felt almost dreamlike to him. He found himself sitting in a type of big armchair, and he was surrounded by those same 3-foot-tall, yellow-suited humanoids that had entered his bedroom 12 days earlier. He really couldn't remember anything else but sitting in this chair. The next thing he knew, he was standing in front of the wall of the Grandero Begoria Cemetery, quite some distance away, and 15 hours had passed. In fact, it was now 2:30 p.m. the next day. The only physical evidence he had of his encounter was a small black spot on his index finger, as if a sample of blood had been taken. He was quite dazed and confused. He wasn't sure where he was at first. He ended up taking 2 buses to get home. Upon arriving home, he learned that his family had been looking for him, as he usually does not stay away without informing them. He did have a family member who worked for the police, and they were in fact still searching for him when he arrived home. He immediately told his family what happened, and then he went to see a doctor. He says that the encounter convinced him that UFOs and aliens are real and that, quote, there must be something to it. News of his encounter spread quickly through the neighborhood, which renewed interest in the subject in the town of Rosario, much to the dismay of Juan, who really did not want any attention from his encounter. Well, this is a single witness case, and as far as I know, it wasn't investigated by professional UFO researchers. It's quite compelling in that the witness was in fact missing for quite a long time. His family was looking for him, By all accounts, he's a trustworthy and sincere person. And of course, there was some physical evidence to support his encounter. What to me is really interesting is that he only remembered literally moments of being on board this craft. So where was he during all these missing hours? Or what was happening to him? Very hard to say for sure, but an absolutely fascinating case. Also interesting because other people were seeing UFOs in that area at that time. All right, now let's move to the next onboard UFO encounter. I call this one, "You Did Good." That's a quote from the ETs to the witness. This one occurred on March 7, 1988 in an undisclosed location in Texas. Again, this case is not professionally investigated, but the witness did provide a first-hand eyewitness testimony, and there's some really interesting elements to this case. All of these cases, I think, have some insights into what it's like to have first-hand contact with what appear to be extraterrestrials. This case was reported to the Mutual UFO Network by the witness about 34 years after it occurred. The witness is anonymous. He was 14 years old when he had his encounter. I'll just call him Gene, which is of course a pseudonym. It was March 7, 1988, and Gene was living at his parents' home in an undisclosed location in Texas. On that night, he went out of the house and walked to the end of the driveway to smoke a cigarette. As he was doing so, a group of round red lights blinking on and off caught his eye, and looking up, he saw that they appeared to be in a roughly triangular formation. They immediately began to maneuver in a way that defied any conventional explanation. As Gene says, "It flashed across the sky to the right of me, stayed for a second, then flashed across the sky behind me. I turned around and looked up at it. And then, all of a sudden, small, different colored lights started going around in circles back and forth. A bright, blinding white light showed down in the middle." It was now 1 a.m., and suddenly Gene found himself someplace else. As Gene says, "The next thing I remember was lying on a table on my back, looking up at a mechanical device that was coming down towards my right eye. It was scary, and I was trying to move, but couldn't. The next thing, I felt someone's or something's hand on either side of my neck, and I heard a voice in my mind telling me that it's okay. He knows it looks scary, but it won't hurt, and I won't remember anything, that it's almost over and I'm doing great." Now Gene was so scared that at this point he just passed out. As Gene says, "The next time I woke up, I was on the same silver table, and on my right side, curled up. The room I was in was really bright. The walls were silver looking in a way, but it was also very bright. There was a group of people talking about me, but not with their mouths like normal. I could tell they were female. I can't remember their faces. It was like they were blocked out. They looked like they were wearing doctor coats though. When they realized I was awake, the tallest one came over to me, put his hand on my shoulder, told me I did good, and I was almost home. He didn't talk to me with his mouth. I heard him in my mind. I fell back asleep." So that turned out to be the end of the experience, or all that Gene could remember. As he says, "I woke up in my driveway, standing the opposite way, waving to the red circles in the sky, telling them bye. For some reason, I felt like I would see them again. I went to take a drag from my cigarette and realized it was gone. I went inside my house to get another one and realized it was almost 7 a.m. I am missing 6 hours." Gene closes his account saying that at age 17 in 1992, he had to go to the doctor for abdominal surgery. The doctor removed, quote, "a triangle microchip from my belly during the surgery." Again, a pretty short and standard case of a gentleman who is physically examined by ETs, but certainly fascinating. One detail that I found really interesting is that the witness said he had trouble focusing on seeing the ETs' faces. This is a rare detail that does turn up in a number of cases. Just a few episodes ago, there was another case where a gentleman described exactly the same thing. And again, there's some physical evidence to support this case in terms of the witness's claims that he had what appears to be some sort of implant removed from his body by doctors. All right, let's move to the next case. This one involves a young child who had an encounter. I call this one, It Really Did Happen. This occurred in 1989 in Larne, Wales. This is a small little picturesque town. And again, this is a fully consciously recalled onboard encounter and was professionally investigated by an experienced researcher. This case was investigated by Captain Gordon Millington of the Surrey Investigation Group on Aerial Phenomenon. The witness is anonymous, and Captain Gordon Millington gave the witness the pseudonym Elaine Marks. Elaine says that at age 12, she was taken on board an extraterrestrial craft. It was 1989, and at that time she was staying with her parents in a log cabin at the top of a steep hill in the small town of Larne, Wales. This is very famous as the home place of the poet Dylan Thomas, and of course for its picturesque beauty. There's a really cool castle there. But one evening, Elaine woke up to hearing a strange sound, which she described as like branches knocking against the window. But the thing was, there were no trees next to the house, so this frightened her, and she immediately called for her mother, who agreed to sleep in the bed next to hers. Now her mother apparently fell asleep, but Elaine was awake, and she says she saw green and red lights shining in from the window. At the same time, she felt a strange paralysis creeping up from her legs towards her head. Frightened, she tried to call out to her mother, but found herself unable to speak, and as Elaine says, suddenly everything went black, and I found myself on a type of thick metal table with 3 or 4, quote, people around me. Their eyes were large, oval and black, and filled up a lot of their face. They were quite skinny, and had the same type of build as humans, although they were quite a bit shorter. I'd say about 5 feet tall. They weren't wearing anything, I think, but they looked as though they had on very tight catsuits, which were plain light turquoise, and fitted to them as though it was their skin, so it must have been their own skin. They didn't speak at all. They just looked at each other awkwardly. I screamed, but the scream didn't come out from me lying on the table. It came from somewhere in the distance. Elaine found this experience very frightening, and she was unable to remember any further details. As she says, everything went black again, and I found myself lying in my bed again, and I felt myself gradually being able to move again. I called out to my mom, and I felt a bit sick. Now Elaine's mother woke up and comforted her, and told her that it must have been a dream. Elaine didn't think so at first, but trusting her mother and being just a kid, she tried to convince herself that yes, it had all been just a dream. But a few years later, she was reading a magazine which presented the story of another little girl who believed she had been visited by a strange alien figure who came into her bedroom and poked her in the neck. Now Elaine, reading this, not only remembered her own encounter at age 12, but she remembered another encounter at age 7, when she had been afraid of a presence in the room and hid from it under the duvet. She said this entity approached her and poked her in the neck. She did not see the entity, but the girl in the magazine mentioned waking up without her underwear on, and that also sparked a memory. As Elaine says, I remember going to bed with a nightie on, and knickers as well, but when I woke up the next day, my knickers were nowhere to be seen. I know this sounds very strange, but it really did happen. I remember having really bad pains whenever I tried to go to the loo that day. Now Elaine also says that after the 1989 experience in Larne, she began having more encounters and that they would continue for years. As Elaine says, after my experience in Larne, the same thing happened about twice afterwards, but only when I feel paralyzed and feel I'm falling. But I always seem to fall asleep straight after it and only remember the next morning that it happened yet again. It happens about once a year now. To tell the truth, I am just utterly gobsmacked by all of this because I've never really thought about it in depth. Now Elaine was 16 years old when she was interviewed by Captain Gordon Millington. And as he says, quote, no one familiar with the abduction scenario can doubt that this lively, intelligent young English schoolgirl has been selected from an early age for the attentions of a type of alien more commonly associated with such incidents in the USA, and that the annual abductions she mentions prefigure what can be expected now that she stands on the threshold of womanhood. Elaine had the courage and common sense to come forward with her story and will be offered whatever advice and support can be given. But how many other young people have kept to themselves similar experiences which cause them stress, bewilderment, and even feelings of quite undeserved guilt? And if they take their problems to doctors, nurses, or social workers, what kind of a response can they expect? Again, this case shows the details and the patterns we see in so many cases, with contact starting at a very young age, kids telling their parents and not being believed and being told it was all just a dream, but then having more encounters. And also, this encounter sparking memories of early encounters. Rarely is an onboard experience a one-off. Almost always, people who have onboard encounters were probably visited as young kids and will later have sightings and more onboard encounters. That's not always the case, but it's certainly a prominent pattern. Now let's move to the next case. This one has some unusual details I've absolutely never heard before. It appears to be an entirely serious report. The witness is not anonymous in this case, and the case was investigated by a very experienced researcher. I call this one, Aliens Took My $20 Bill. This one occurred on June 8, 1991 in Centerville, Indiana. And yeah, it's one of so many amazing cases taking place all over the world. This absolutely astonishing case comes from researcher Don Worley, who conducted a thorough on-site investigation, interviewed the witness, and published a summary of the case in the issue number 437 of the MUFON UFO Journal. The witness is Timothy Brandenburg. On Saturday, June 8, 1991, he was with his wife in their trailer home located at 1591 Rice Road in Centerville, Indiana. It was at night, and Timothy's wife was at church. Without warning, Timothy's dogs began howling in an unusual manner from the backyard, and he heard what sounded kind of like a tractor noise. So going outside to investigate, he was shocked at what he saw. Hovering in the darkness, low over the fields behind his house beyond the fenced yard, were some strange lights. Still thinking that it was a farmer on a tractor and that something might be wrong, he took a few steps forward. But as he got closer, he saw that this was no tractor. The lights were in fact hovering above the ground, and he could now see that they were on a curved object. And getting an even closer look, he realized that it was an alien spaceship, a 30-foot wide disc-shaped craft. Alarmed, he immediately began to back up. He remembered that he had been visited when he was just a young boy, and he was about to turn and run when this craft zoomed forward and emitted a beam of light, striking his body. This caused a mild pain in his chest. He was looking at the ground when this happened, when the UFO beam hit him, and the next thing he knew, he was inside the craft looking down at a white floor. Looking around, he saw that he was now in a large chamber. At the other side of the room stood two gray aliens who were watching him studiously. He says they were 6 to 7 feet tall, with very skinny bodies, flat features, slanted eyes, long fingers on their hands. It sounds like grays. They immediately approached him, communicating to him telepathically, or as he said, with a, quote, mental voice. They told him, "Don't be afraid. We are not going to hurt you." One of them extended its arm towards him. Now, thinking that they wanted something from him, for some reason Timothy automatically reached into his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill that just happened to be there, and handed it over to them. The gray took the dollar bill, turned it over, seemed to examine it, and handed it to the other gray. Now Timothy did not see what the other gray did with this $20 bill, but almost immediately the first gray reached out again, and this time grabbed Timothy by his right wrist. A short black pen-like object with a blunt end appeared in the gray's hand, and the ET moved this instrument vertically 3 times over the skin on the inside elbow of his arm. Timothy was then made to understand that he was to go sit on a chair-like device. The Gray then held another instrument, rectangular, silver, about the size of a cigarette pack, near Timothy's left temple. Timothy immediately blacked out, he believes because of this instrument, and when he woke up, he was back in bed. It was now 10 a.m., and 13 hours had passed. He felt somewhat unwell, as though he had, quote, had a very bad night out. He immediately remembered what occurred. He wondered if it might all have been a weird dream, but then he saw 3 long purple-red marks on his arm. He also had a bloody nose, and when he went to the bathroom, his urine was very dark colored. So Timothy went to the police and made a report explaining that he had been kidnapped by aliens and taken on board their craft. He described the whole encounter, including the fact that the ETs took his $20 bill, which was now missing. He never saw it again. The police did not believe him. Nevertheless, they did do a write-up on the case, and a small paragraph about his case did appear in the local newspaper, the Richmond, Indiana Palladium. It was this little article that caught the attention of UFO researcher Don Worley, who happened to live only 7 miles away in nearby Connorsville. Don Worley not only interviewed the witness, but went to his home, talked to him in depth, examined the witness and the site of the encounter. As Don Worley says, I was able to observe on the man's arm 3 purple marks 5 inches long, which appeared to be beneath his skin. They were small and fairly straight. In the backyard of the house, I made a careful examination and took photographs and checked for radiation and for magnetic deviation. I took samples from 2 circular burned patches in the grass, each 16 inches wide and 6 feet equidistant on each side of the spot from which he had been zapped. Don Worley did visit Timothy again, and the marks on his arm were still there, and he continued to communicate by mail with the witness, but later learned that his wife, who Don described as, quote, a religious fanatic, was actually destroying the letters. So that kind of ended Don Worley's communication with the witness. I find that a very compelling case. Yeah, there is that very unusual detail of the ETs taking his $20 bill. I haven't heard that before. I wonder where that money is now, presumably still on board the craft. But it's certainly not the only case where people describe having missing items, missing possessions that they never get back again. Very glad that Don Worley was the investigator to this case. I understand that he has a file that's quite lengthy describing his investigation into this case. Wasn't able to find that file. I suspect there are more details. But again, there is physical proof to support this encounter in terms of the witness having marks on his arm, and also Don Worley describes seeing with his own eyes physical landing traces. Again, I would love to see photographs of those. Also interesting is that the witness went straight to the police the next morning. Not a lot of witnesses do that. Most people remain completely silent, so kudos to him for stepping forward. All right, now let's move to the last and final case, which is also very extensive, consciously recalled, occurred during the middle of a massive UFO wave, and does have landing traces and other forms of physical evidence. I call this one, I Can't Get It Out of My Mind. This one occurred in 1992 in Adjuntas, Puerto Rico. And this is an absolutely incredible onboard UFO encounter. This case comes from Puerto Rico researcher Magdalena del Amo Frichedo and first appeared in the July 1992 issue of the Spanish language publication Espacio y Tiempo, which means space and time. The witness is anonymous, so I'll just call him Luis. Luis lived in New York for 30 years, but ended up returning to live in his native town of San Lorenzo, Puerto Rico. And it was shortly after he moved that he had his UFO encounter. It was one day in 1992, the exact date is not given, so this should be considered approximate, that he was in San Lorenzo and went on his way to visit his brother. He was walking through a small valley when he stopped and looked up, and as Luis says, I saw this thing, like a big round shadow falling down on top of me. and suddenly something, a force, grabbed me, as though I was caught in a net, and it lifted me. And then, when I came to my senses again, I am inside a big machine and sitting in a sort of armchair that looked as though made of bronze, but soft, and I wasn't able to move. I tried to do so, but couldn't. Now, per Luis, the room had metallic walls, bronze in color, and lit by a faint golden-orange light which emitted from the edges. The ceiling was rounded, but dark with points of lights, much like stars. He immediately noticed 4 or 5 humanoids moving around nearby, passing through an open doorway, and as Luis says, they were a bit shorter than us, and weren't like us. They were wearing helmets, and their heads were big, and their eyes big too. Their eyes were big and elongated and a bit protruding, and of a greenish color, with a bright orangish or red part in them, in the center. They had no ears, only little holes, and their mouths were thin, without lips, and for noses they only had 2 little holes. They were thin, skinny, and wearing a sort of grayish-colored clothing. The clothing covered their whole bodies and was close-fitting, very close-fitting, all as far as the neck and down to the hands. The hands had 4 long fingers, and they came down almost to the level of the knees. These people's skin was of a yellowish-green color, sort of a grayish, a very queer color. Now Luis said that 2 or 3 of these beings approached him and began to speak to him telepathically, but he was only able to understand part of it. As Luis says, he told me to stay calm, that they weren't going to do anything to me, and that they only wanted to see something. Then they came up close to me again and said that they were going to put me into special clothing like theirs, which was to prevent me from becoming harmed by the high speed at which they were going to travel to the place from which they come. They put that clothing on me, a gray thing, like they were wearing themselves, and then I felt a sort of thrust as though the thing I was in was moving very fast. I felt heat, and then after a while we had arrived somewhere where everything looked as though made of bronze, like a dark golden greenish shade. Luis was able to look outside a window in the room and saw buildings and other flying saucer craft. He could see other ETs inside them and other humans. He saw a brilliant ball of light above which illuminated the scene, but it wasn't clear to him where they were. At one point, one of the beings took a hold of Luis's hand and examined his cheap wristwatch. His wristwatch had a little hologram of a crucifix on its face, and afterwards, this crucifix was slightly enlarged and more golden. Luis said he also had what looked like a healed burn scar on his wrist after the being had grabbed him. They then took off the ET jumpsuit and put him back in his own clothes. They asked him why he lived in San Lorenzo and if he was from somewhere else. Luis was in fact born in the Puerto Rico town of Adjuntas, and they told him that he must be returned to the place he came from. The next thing Luis knew, he felt the same strange force that had overcome him when he was taken, and now he found himself lying on the ground in the bushes. The craft was above him, and it quickly sped out of sight. As Luis says, terrified, I scrambled to my feet and shouted for help. 2 men heard me and came to my assistance, and they took me to the police headquarters, and I was in Adjuntas. It had been about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they had grabbed me, and when they released me, it was about 5 p.m., so 3 hours had elapsed. Now, incredibly, there were 2 witnesses who actually saw Luis be returned to Earth. Ruben Perez Velez and Juan Caballero were in Adjuntas with their horses when their horses began to jump around in fear. And I'll just quote Ruben Perez Velez directly. As he says, I looked, and then we spotted a big circular area where the grass was all flattened, and around the edges of the area the standing grass was twisting and turning all around. And I said to Juan, it must be a tornado. Let's get out of here. We turned round and we were just about to leave when we heard somebody shouting desperately for help. And when we looked again to see what it was, we saw that the wind in the circle had disappeared, but that there was now a man lying on the ground right in the very middle of the place where the circle had been. We ran to him, and the man picked himself up. He was jolly scared. He asked us to help him, to take him to a church, to the police. Real scared he was. Luis briefly explained to the men that, quote, some queer beings had carried him off in a flying saucer and then dropped him off here. As the witness Reuben says, "The chap was quite sober, and he truly was very scared, very nervous. I didn't know what to think about his story. But the fact is that he hadn't been there just a few moments before, when we were looking, and then he appeared there instantaneously, right in the middle of that flattened grass circle, with the grass all around, twisting and turning. That's what made me believe his story, because he hadn't been there just before. We are both sure of that. And another thing is that it had been raining, and the ground was muddy. But when the man got up, he was absolutely clean, with no mud on his clothing, and his hat too, which was thrown down beside him, was completely clean. All of which is of course impossible, but all the same, that's how it was." Now at the time of Luis's encounter, there had been a deluge of reports of UFO activity, particularly in the Adjuntas area. The police there dealt with reports, they said, almost daily. And as Police Sergeant Rivera said, "What he told us didn't surprise us, and so we gave him a body scan with a Geiger counter. It showed no reaction, but when we ran it over his watch, the watch gave an instantaneous response. The needle leaped to the top, and after that, there was no more reaction. But all of us had seen how it jumped." One final interesting aspect to Luis's encounter was his answer to researchers when they asked him if he had been frightened during his encounter. And as Luis told them, "When you are with them, you don't have fear or nerves. It's as though, with their minds, they do something to stop you from being scared. But when they have let you go, it's then that you get the terror and the nerves. My nerves are still badly upset by it. Indeed, it's worse than that. For tomorrow I'm going to see my doctor to ask for something to make me sleep, because ever since the day when that happened, I can't think of anything else, and I can't sleep well. I can't get it all out of my mind." Such an amazing case for so many reasons. Not only were people seeing UFOs at the time this gentleman was taken, but he had witnesses who saw him being returned. That's absolutely astonishing and very, very rare. There's only a few cases of that. But yeah, quite a bit of physical evidence in terms of landing traces, physiological effects on the witness, his watch showing evidence of radiation. So yeah, there's really good physical evidence to support the validity of this case. It's interesting to me that the ETs asked him where he was born and kind of insisted on putting him down in that location, which was not where he lived. So this is one of many instances where people were taken from one location and put down in quite another location. Also interesting to me is how he described his emotions during the encounter, which he felt he was kind of sedated and calm, whereas afterwards all the fear came rushing back to him. And I certainly can't blame him for saying that this was an experience that he couldn't get out of his mind. But again, fully consciously recalled, these cases cannot be explained away as false memory syndrome or sleep paralysis, despite what so many skeptics and debunkers keep trying to say. It's ridiculous. Sleep paralysis does not leave marks on the ground. Sleep paralysis does not have outside witnesses who see UFOs or people being returned. Sleep paralysis does not move you from one location to another. We need to stop putting forth these kinds of explanations or taking them seriously. I think it's pretty clear what's going on. Disclosure is ramping up. The subject is going mainstream. Sooner or later, all officialdom is going to have to recognize that people are having direct contact with ETs to the extent that they're even being taken on board, given all kinds of information. Again, these are the cases that strike to the very heart of the UFO phenomenon, and I think they are the most important cases of all because they contain the most information. So if you really want answers as to what's going on, I wouldn't look to our government. They're still lying. They're still withholding all kinds of information and evidence. I think if we really want the answers, we need to look to the contactees, the people who have had direct contact. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, guys. I truly appreciate you all watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time.